Hello and welcome to yet another Patreon edition of the Terrace Scottish Football Podcast. My name is Craig Anderson and I'm joined by my fellow legislative correspondent, Mr. Euan Taylor.
Hello, Craig. The two guys that seem to be assigned to read boring things and then try and turn them into a Patreon episode, I think. Though this actually, I would say this is not boring. It's actually a very good read what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I think you're right. It's like trying to maybe it's a compliment to us, Euan, that we are obviously so interested in turning dull things or lengthy documents into interesting stuff. Now, if you're listening, you'll be wondering what on earth we're talking about unless you've read the title of the podcast. But last week, the Scottish FA published a report titled about the transition from academy to first team football. So basically about the lack, essentially, or the barriers that maybe exist in terms of young footballers coming out of academies in Scotland and going into first team football. And it was a really interesting report. There are a lot of people who are like self-proclaimed experts on this type of thing, I would say, online, where they literally just post these tables of here's how many minutes young players have played and don't have don't put any context into it. And I was kind of a bit like, I knew it was coming out of the SFA, it was probably not going to just say that. I was kind of preparing myself for something quite simplistic.
Yes.
But I would argue we'll get on to the depth of the report and whether some of the things are actually feasible, but the recommendations and the breadth of them and the amount of research and work that's gone into this, I think, was really impressive to me.
Yes, yeah. So it's 114 pages, and I think some of the articles in the papers last week, like Graham McGarry did a good one. It wasn't that it wasn't 114 pages. It was lengthy though, but I mean it has to be because I think fundamentally this is a very complex problem in Scottish football. It is a problem that I think we're all sort of seeing now. And many people, as you sort of said, a lot of people on Twitter identify the problem, sometimes come up with a quite simplistic solution to it, and we're probably all guilty of it to some extent. But this report really does look into identifies the problem, sets out the problem, and how Scottish football really doesn't stack up well in a variety of metrics when you're sort of judging development of footballers, and suggests quite a few ways that the other countries have tried to solve that, and also suggests sort of solutions that may particularly work in Scottish football. Whether that is the case remains to be seen.
I think I do often think just to the focus of the report, so it's not anything to do with how we develop young players up in youth football. It's nothing to do with the coaching. That's not what's being addressed here. So I mean, you're still going to have questions. Are we coaching players well enough up to age 16 to 17, 18? But the predominant idea of this report is when they hit that age where, I mean, we saw obviously Spain at the Euros with a 16-year-old starting every game. It was a 16-year-old up until the final. It was a 17-year-old in the final. So the tendency out there. But it's typical, isn't it? As soon as you get to the final, you stop playing your 16-year-old.
Yeah.
There is a gap, and I think it's pretty clear there's a gap in development now. There have been loads of suggestions as to why that is, from physical, literally maybe our players are not physically as developed at 16. That was spoken about a lot. That was the kind of Gordon Strachan theory, I think. That stuff about the cutthroat nature of the league not allowing it, I think that was debunked quite in depth in this report by identifying several other leagues which have similar numbers of teams, similar numbers of games, and similar relegation structures, and yet many more young players playing. So I thought that was interesting, because that doesn't ring true to me. Because to me, if you're in a relegation battle or you're not, you're picking the player who you think is going to be better for the team, and you're also thinking about the long term of the club. And if you don't have a competitive league, you can play all the young players you want, but they're not really going to learn. So there's a bit of a balance. So I found that part interesting, but I think there was a lot more to it than that kind of surface level stuff, I would say. Was there anything that kind of stuck out for you just as a headline issues?
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose there's the external factor, which I think we've talked about before. And there's always been, I think, in Scottish youth development, there's always been the internal external factor, which is the old firm. Now that is probably the old firm are like a massive differentiating factor between nations of a similar size to Scotland and Scotland, because they exist in Scotland, and they're massive clubs, and they are bigger than the equivalent clubs in countries like Denmark or Croatia, where they're bigger in budgets, probably bigger in expectations, not always bigger in actual results in European terms, but they are bigger clubs, and that's always probably they've always sucked in probably a lot of the best talent in the country and not really been the best at developing it. Obviously, there are success stories with the old firm developing young players, but not enough, and you can see why that would be the case in those clubs. There's now the external factor of the better players going down to England, and that is discussed in terms of how few of these players are playing before the age of 19 when they go down to England. And actually, that was one of the big takeaways, I suppose, is that they listed quite a few players and talked about effectively you need to be, if you're going to make it at a top level, you probably need to be playing first team football at 16. If not, then definitely 17. And then if you're not playing by 18, you're pretty much done. In terms of making it at the top level, which is I don't know how many fans think of it like that, and I had sort of been saying that before. I remember doing a podcast possibly with Tony, but you might have been on it as well, Craig, and saying that I thought one of the big changes that was going to have to happen in Scottish football was that players are going to have to play a lot earlier than we're used to, as in playing at 16 in the first team, and I think you can. That I do think is borne out in this report in terms of, because a lot of the young players that was mentioned elsewhere, that a lot of young players would cite that they would want to move. Why did you move? Because they've talked to a lot of stakeholders, which is one of the impressive things. They've talked to people across the game. They've talked to young players. They've talked to coaches. They've talked to first team managers. They've talked to sporting directors. There's a variety of people spoken to, and the young players said, well, basically, why would you stay in Scotland if you're not being given a pathway to the first team? Why not go down south? It's a higher level. You're probably getting paid a lot more money on day one. So why would you stay if you're not going to play first team football where you are anyway? And I think that is the big that'd be, if there was one takeaway, I think it would be you have to the best young players have to be convinced that there is actually a pathway to stay. So if you look at, probably the biggest success story in Scottish youth development terms right now, would be Lennon Miller. And he is playing, he was playing for Motherwell when he was 16. He was an absolute first pick when he was 17. And he's either just turned 18 or just about to turn 18.
Just turned 18 at the weekend, yeah.
Yeah, so, and he's now Motherwell's best player. And, sent up 2 goals at the weekend, obviously, against Hearts. So, and now he's going to he's going to move on. Obviously, unless injury or something happens with Miller, he'll move on, and he'll move on for a big fee, and he'll move on as a first team player wherever he goes. Now, you would think he'll be going in as a first team player, whereas lots of other players and this was the internal external I was talking about with Bailey Rice, who went to Rangers, same age as Lennon Miller, more or less, played in all the same Scottish youth teams, were both considered, I think, as far as I'm aware, equally good. Maybe Rice was even considered a slightly better prospect at the time. Rice has hardly played for Rangers, and he's always on the bench at the weekend, but he's not getting the minutes. And I think Rangers tried to sign Lennon Miller this summer and would have, and would probably be too expensive for them. That he would have been, if Miller had gone to Rangers, he would have been, signed to play ahead of a guy who was probably equally as good 2 years ago, and that's just because he's not. One's been given a chance, the other one hasn't. So it's that takeaway is, I suppose, the big thing is that how do you get guys at 16 playing first team football? and there are some Scottish peculiarities as to why I think that's hard. And yeah, they did look into why other countries do it, and there isn't really a correlation. In fact, if there's anything, there's an opposite correlation to if you play young players, you actually be more successful than the sort of bias that's not the case in Scotland.
I think it's always a bit of chicken and egg with that though, because you can point out like Dinamo Zagreb, and it's like they might also be that their young players happen to be brilliant, so it's like there is a chicken and an egg there. But the overall point holds, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that for me, I often think this with Scottish football is, it's like it can be a little bit of I don't mean a victim of its own success, but like when you see other similar sized countries, you talk about Rangers and Celtic being bigger clubs, like probably every top flight club with one or two exceptions, in fact probably not really any exceptions this season, maybe one, are like really quite big clubs for the level of club, like they're well supported clubs for the level that they're at, if you know what I mean. And therefore, like, I think it is much easier to be. It was much easier for Queen's Park, for example, to especially when they don't seem to care about what their fans think anyway, to become like essentially a development club. Whereas if for a smaller club in Scotland, like in the Premiership, you can't just say we're giving up this season or we're doing this. Like there has to be. There's going to be a lot more pushback than I think you'll get in other places. Now that's something that has to be addressed. It's not something that's insurmountable, because as you've said, there's evidence actually if you can get the right system, playing young players will make you better. And I think fans want to see young players, but I think there has to be there's like this perception issue that has to be overcome. And I think the fact that our big clubs, there's a demand on results because there's big support, means like short-termism can be quite appealing at times.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's also a very engaged fan base, and I mean that as in terms of Scottish football as a whole, which I think one negative effect of that, I mean, generally it's positive, and we all love Scottish football, but I've talked about it before, that nobody wants to be the main character in Scottish football. And there's always somebody. Right now it's probably Hearts, Stephen A. Smith. They've had a shocking start to the season. So, the pressure becomes unbearable because people just, you constantly talk about it, and then, a change gets made, pretty quickly. And it's hard for clubs to withstand that, because it is such a small, I mean, everybody at every level loves laughing at somebody, and there's always somebody to laugh at. And it's very difficult for clubs to, I think, to withstand that. Even if you'd think, well, actually, I mean, who cares about St Mirren? They don't have that big a fan base. The whole of Scottish football cares about St Mirren if there's something funny happening at St Mirren. And it's very hard, and I'm just picking them as an example, but it's very difficult for clubs to be able to sort of stick to their guns and stick to a strategy, I think. And it's also there's another thing I've sort of talked about before, but it's like, I don't, Scottish football is whole, and this does go back to the thing of our leagues are very small, and it's very, very competitive throughout the league structure. And maybe there are examples of other countries which are like that, but I do think Scottish football prioritises in its whole structure excitement over and maybe entertainment and competitiveness over development, and that's how. I think that's probably how Scottish people want it, ultimately.
Yeah, and I think that's it. And I think there's this because this just on the first page of the report itself, it's saying like, why should we care about this report? And it's having to give obviously, the national team is the thing that benefits. Is the thing that obviously benefits from having better players available, but there's always this trade-off, because you could make 100 changes purely to benefit the national team, and probably some countries have done this, but it would be quite a lot to the detriment of the clubs. And we also care about our clubs, but the case that's being made here is that if young players are playing and there's more transition from the club's point of view, the evidence, as you mentioned, is that they tend to perform better domestically and in Europe, which is definitely. Realistically, the only chance you're going to get to have, the only chance St Mirren are going to get to have a John McGinn in their team is not by signing them, it's by developing them. Or the same, like you talk about Lenny Miller. Motherwell can't go out and buy a player of that quality. So the only chance you have, so in theory that makes sense, you're going to be able to compete with a higher quality of team if you have this. And also there's a financial side, there's less expenditure because your youth players are cheaper and you have to sign them. And also you don't have to put them up in a house, all the rest of it, probably. And clubs who do it will see increasing revenue very clearly. You won't be able to sell your best young players. At some point, a Scottish team in the next few years is going to win the lucky jackpot, which is going to be like one of the young players that they've sold on to England with a sell-on clause will go for like £100 million, just like by pure chance. And they'll make a fortune, but it'll become a record ever sale. But there's the financial part. So yeah, there's the obvious focus on the national team, and the national team would improve by this, but it's trying to make the case that the clubs will get better as well. But it's that collective approach. But there are some approaches where, and I'm not saying that, and we'll get onto it, where the views of the clubs and the views of the supporter bases of clubs will prevent a move which the evidence suggests will make youth development. I always just try to be cryptic. It's on the context of B teams. There's I said something I do believe, like, and if the only focus of Scottish football was make the national team better, you would put like 2 or 3, 4 B teams in the second tier, and that's what, like, that would undoubtedly improve some players. But the cost for me and the cost for most supporters is far too high on that, in terms of the impact it has on what are still big clubs and the impact it has on the integrity of that division. We'll talk about other things associated with that, with the integrity of it. But the report kind of addresses that as well, because there's a whole section on this, and it basically says having B teams at a high, like having B teams in the Lowland League has helped the very youngest players in terms of getting some minutes, but it's at not at a good enough level. So the clubs that have the B team still feel there's a need for a further transition period. So it has not really achieved the goal that it's been set out to do. And obviously the report basically says if they were in at a higher level, that would do it, but there's not sufficient support from the clubs for that to happen. And so to me, this is signing the death warrant of B teams, this report, because the actual initiative was heavily pushed by the SFA. It was definitely something that they supported, the inclusion of the B teams in the Lowland League at the first instance, but they were seeing that as basically a way of legitimising B teams briefly while they cooked up the Conference League and all of these things. But those were like soundly rejected, and this to me is saying B teams might work in some places, but it's not for Scotland. We're not going to be doing it. That's how I read this report and the aspect part on that.
Yeah, I think they probably. I mean, I think that's probably politically sound from the writers of this report, because if their big takeaway had been B teams, then the whole thing would have just been like pilloried straight away. And people have made up their mind on B teams. And as you say, I think, as a pure development tool, yes, they would help. I mean, I don't think there's any way you could say that they wouldn't. The way they've been implemented in Scotland, they obviously don't, because it's just, as I say, it's not a high enough level. It's meant to be like a finishing school, and it doesn't work like that. It's actually just was probably a bit better than playing under 18 games, probably. But even then, there's probably not much difference there. And I think, I mean, people just wouldn't. And I can understand entirely why them getting plonked into the second tier would start a riot. So it's just, that's just not going to happen. Scottish football is not set up in a way that would allow that to happen. It's not strong enough from a central body perspective. I don't think either the SFA nor certainly not the SPFL are strong enough to actually ignore that. Ignore the clubs that would be completely up in arms about it. There is obvious, I mean, and that structure in itself is probably a problem. There is an element of, and it gets people's backs up if you use this sort of terminology, but I mean, the tail does wag the dog in Scottish football. It just does, because of how many senior football clubs there are, the voting structure, everyone's votes equal. that is what happens. So the opinions of Stirling Albion matter the same as the opinions of Celtic, and you can say that's a good thing in some ways, but in other ways, it's like it doesn't really lead to a sort of it's certainly not conducive to trying to implement like a top-down structure for Scottish football to improve Scottish football, full stop, particularly in development terms.
Yeah,
because you've just got too many constituencies that you're trying to please, and you could argue whether they all have. I mean, how does Stirling Albion fans probably care more about the Scottish national team than Celtic fans do? You would think that's quite possibly the case, but it doesn't mean that they don't care about their own club, and they're what they're watching every week, and they don't want to watch B teams. This obviously, I suppose we'll come on to speak about it now. The plan, the report sort of recommends a sort of a middle ground of cooperation clubs, I think it calls them.
Yeah.
Which is where they're talking about potentially up to 5 players being on a list that allows them to play for either their parent club or their cooperation club. And for that to basically, and for clubs to be able to have more than one across the structure, but like one in each division. So, for example, Rangers could have an agreement with Falkirk, Queen of the South, and Edinburgh City, and that would be across and they could have 5 players on loan each of those, but they'd also be able to play for Rangers if required. I don't know about that, and I think it's an interesting one to me, that if that would be any more palatable to lower league fans than B teams.
So to me, I think that this to me is one of the recommendations coming out of this that will happen, because I think we've seen kind of somewhat less formal versions of this agreement a few times. Like definitely Hibs have been big on it with like Edinburgh City in the past, and I think they basically seem to have it with Queen of the South in terms of the amount of players that they go there. But there have been these relationships, but just to give a bit of flesh to what these there's an example of how the cooperation system might work, and it's something that the report says Austria, Belgium, Croatia, Hungary, and Serbia use, and it's been one of the things that FIFA have kind of proposed as a solution in general to youth players. But it basically says that if a Premiership or Championship club can be the parent club and have this agreement, and the players go out to the other club, the main club pays their salary, and they remain on like a joint registration list, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that, and it's only Scotland eligible players, it says, are up to a certain age that could be used in this way. And those players can move outside the transfer window. So it basically would mean, for example, because one of the things it highlights in general is that clubs will have young players, but because of the way the transfer system works at the moment, you can't like really loan players between windows. So if you've got your second choice right back, or maybe even your like a young player, like a young winger who you want to give some minutes to, but they're down the pecking order, you sometimes hang on to them in case you've got an injury. Whereas this would let them basically go out to another club, but if you had that injury crisis, they could come back and still play for you, and they can still play for you, which is allowed at the moment as well. You can still play for your youth team and stuff like that. One of the other recommendations, which makes perfect sense, is that youth team games are currently on a Friday night, and therefore, like, players get sometimes pulled out their youth team because they're going to be in the squad for the first team, and they suggested, well, why not have that after the first team games on a Monday? That makes sense, and that'll happen. But on this cooperation club, a small number, they can move between clubs, and the parent club have the final say, but it basically says, like, in practice where this has happened, clearly if the parent club is taking the piss and constantly dragging back players to like not play them or sit them on the bench and they're not featuring, obviously the other club isn't going to be that happy with that, and these parent clubs tend not to then find teams to sign agreements with, so there has to be a mutual agreement kind of thing. And it says there are several players working together at the same club. It obviously helps them, if you're young players, to be kind of developing like, rather than being out as an individual at a club and maybe away from friends and all the rest of it. And it says that would allow them to do that with teams right down to the Highland and Lowland League. And it says with a request from clubs, I suspect that is specifically probably like Ross County, for example, will be like, well, we don't want to be having to sign agreements with teams that are like miles from Dingwall when we could have a Highland League club on our doorstep. And it doesn't count towards the loan quota, so you could, in theory, also have proper loans from that team as well. But I think I do understand your issue in terms of like players could disappear at will, but I think in practice it probably wouldn't happen that much. I don't know. We would find out.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely. I suppose it depends. If you obviously like Motherwell have one of the stronger youth development records in recent years of any club. If they had a relationship with a team bottom of the championship and they had 2 or 3 players out on loan, they're obviously that Motherwell might well need all of a sudden a player to start playing for them. So that kind of arrangement might then cause issues competitively. I suppose I struggle to see teams and fans of clubs being happy with being like potentially half their first team 11 effectively being on loan from a specific club, because is that not, I mean, that you're almost becoming a B team yourself at that stage. And that would be my would people be happy if it was, I'm not saying everyone has a big club, obviously that gets lower league fans backs up as well, but if you have a particular dislike of one of the old firms, say, or even a Hearts or Hibs or Aberdeen, whatever, and then all of a sudden your team is Rangers B in the Championship, would you be happy with that? I suspect no, particularly if those players don't perform. And what I think I could guarantee is that those players, particularly if they are at the Championship level, those players, if they do not perform, will be getting dogs abuse.
That's character building, you. I do think you can joke about this. Like, to me, there's a wee bit of a pushback on. I will jokingly say a pushback on woke, but a pushback on some of the practices that I think were maybe becoming commonplace, which was like being quite soft on young players. And I don't say this in a sort of Simon Ferry, like clean their boots and kick them up and down the dressing room way, like he asks every interview. But just stuff like it says, like trying to basically increase a wee bit of an emphasis on competitiveness at youth level and stuff, like a bit more result, like publication more of the results at youth level and just things like that. And I think that kind of ropes into that. Like it is basically saying one of the reasons it's good for young players to go out on loan is to experience like adversity. And I think it spoke a little bit about adversity, and it said even a bad loan spell, even players who had a bad loan spell, is better than not having one. And it specifically said that in there. That some of the I think some of the quotes they'd had from people had suggested that. So that might be something that's of interest as well. Yeah. I think just like looking at like there's a really detailed. I would really recommend, if you've got any interest in this at all, if you're the type of person who's paying for the Terrace Podcast Patreon, I do think you will read this and find it interesting. I don't think like it might be long, but I think you'll see loads of stuff on it.
Yeah.
But I think a few of the other things were in the key recommendations. Potential, I don't think this will happen, potential innovation in cup competitions to try and encourage, like, whether it be quotas or the development of young players. I think clubs consider the 2 main cups to be too important for that, to be honest. But
yeah, that's another one. I mean, the League Cup for me,
it depends to what extent it is. If it's like you have to have an under 19 player in your squad or something, I can imagine that will be fine. But if it starts saying you have to play X and Y, I do think the clubs will push back on that one.
Yeah. I would. I've thought for years that Rangers and Celtic should treat the League Cup as a youth development tool rather than trying to win it. But necessarily, I mean, if they win it, like you remember, like Arsenal used to do when Wenger was there, and because to me there are too many games as it is for especially now with there being sort of more European games in the league stage, why not just use those games purely as a youth development tool? And if you go out to somebody and it's a bit embarrassing, then so be it. But there is this thing of, particularly because Rangers Celtic are quite close now in the amount of major trophies won, that you can't just sacrifice one of the cup competitions like that. I mean, I can understand the other clubs, obviously, because of the structure of Scottish football, you don't have a chance. The league's pretty much out of the picture straight away, so there's only 2 trophies you could win. But for some clubs, that's like their crowning glory is winning a League Cup, and fair play. It just goes. The Scottish football doesn't really see beyond the end of its nose a lot of the time in the League Cup, because a lot of countries, of course, don't even have a League Cup.
And then there's more space in a there's lots of aspects with that. There's a couple of things in there, like it said, like it was basically extolling the virtues of the director of football system, and it said, I mean, it's not. I was kind of reading that, I'm like, they're not going to surely be saying all clubs must have a director of football, but it was basically saying where clubs want to implement that system, the SFA should have a support system in place and like advice and all the rest of it. Like these are the ones that are like, I don't mean doing nothing because there's effort goes into it, but it's like it doesn't actually change Scottish football in any way. It's just like here's some resources and here's some people who can talk. A lot of stuff about young players not having individualised support during that transition phase, and that also there's also a little bit on that some players don't have the right attitude towards it as well, and so there's a lot of bit of like individualised focus in trying to have a better education process. The performance schools, I think, will be something that'll be massively helpful for this. I think we are seeing the graduates of that being a little bit more like they seem a bit smarter in their career choices sometimes as well, and they seem a bit smarter in how they are. Like even when you see them speaking about football, there is a difference to me with some of these guys and how they think about things. But it said one of the big issues it did highlight, it said it's not the only problem, but is these players going to England at 16 basically, or going elsewhere in a couple of cases. And it said trying to basically introduce a form of, it sounded to me like they would quite like legislation to prevent that happening at 16, or at least to make it harder for players to do that. But also said like they were interested in a scholarship system, so basically trying to financially in some way incentivise players to stay in Scotland a little bit longer. Whether the money will exist to come for that, I don't know. But perhaps, again, if that's tied in with performance skills and the players can be convinced of the value of staying in Scotland for their education, there might be something in that. But I would assume academies down south are also putting players that's taking 16-year-olds to school, to be honest. So I don't think that. But there is something in that. But that you don't want to just artificially force players to stay, but like probably there'd be more effort into saying, look, we're not saying you're not going to be able to move to England, but maybe wait until you're 17, 18 to do it at least.
Yeah, I suppose. If you can start to show
the value,
like and I think that's the problem. If you can see, because there's a number where it's like hardly any of them, I'd say hardly any players that have gone down south have actually played first team football before the age of 19. And if you can say, the more examples you have of players that have stayed and then gone on to a move before the age of like 21, or they're already playing at a very a really high level within Scottish football, and being capped by Scotland, or whatever. The more people you can show that there's success stories that have stayed at home at least initially and played ahead of a guy, but now probably if you're looking at the Scottish national team, a lot of people would look at like Billy Gilmore as a success story. He's probably the best youth prospect, at least, that's come out of Scottish football in the last 20 years probably. And that he played for Chelsea when he was 18, but most people won't have done that. So, but he might have been a poster boy for the sort of the wrong thing to do in all respects. Like it worked for him.
There has to be exceptions made, and sometimes you're just good enough. Bendel, probably another one that he goes to Liverpool and he's playing first in football. An injury maybe might set him back a fair bit on that, but these guys are in the Scotland squad at 16, 17, 18 because they're exceptional. So like sometimes like having to remind the player that like this is a shining light and a beacon, but you have to be that good to be able to do it. And some of them will back themselves that they think they are and they're not, and that might also be a problem. But there's a bit on training and like the issues with youth development itself. And something I found quite interesting on it was Real Sociedad saying they invest €1 million a year in partner clubs. So basically, like a lot of the youth teams round about San Sebastian or whatever the Basque name is for it, which I forget, are basically affiliated, and they basically are saying, you're doing the scouting for us, you're doing the development for us, and if they sell on those players, that club gets a 5% cut of the transfer fee. So there's like little things like that could be done, where I think like you see a lot of youth football in Scotland, there could be more affiliation with grassroots to stop players. I think it's very much, it feels like in us and them, it's like these players are in the elite pathway and everything else gets like, the players that are playing at other levels won't kind of mix together.
Yeah.
And there was also stuff, because the SFA have been years going on about Best v Best and had the Project Brave and the elite funding, but they're still saying even with that now, they think a lot of the elite players are not playing against enough other elite players at a young age. Just by dint of there not being that many elite players in Scotland, and there never really will be. But a lot of that is like SFA to lead a thorough analysis of player development at all levels of the game. They can do that, they can recommend things, but that will not be a top level change that people will see instantly. It's just like there might be tweaks in how clubs are funded and stuff. And that's the youth development pathway. And then there was a discussion that league size, basically everyone in Scottish football, according to this, players, managers and coaches, think the leagues should be bigger. They will recommend this to the Professional Game Board and the SPFL, and nothing will happen with that, because the clubs are, unless they can be strongly convinced by the arguments in the report that actually, because it said yes, Scottish clubs are focused on ticket income, merchandise and TV money over player sales, even though it's shown that like player sales are growing massively. There's like 100+% increase in player sales over the last 5 years, compared to a 30% increase in TV rights across Europe. So it's saying maybe that would, like, maybe there is a long-term plan and maybe some of the people will be convinced, but the whole purpose of this kind of little cartel that kind of Hearts involved, but the sort of bigger clubs outside the Rangers and Celtic could set up their wee Deloitte thing. It was like about increasing TV revenue, or financial income for the league, and that was their only interest with that. So it doesn't suggest to me the owners of those clubs are going to push that thing.
No.
And
I think that comes down to them not being, they're not really football people, so so their focus is on the commercial income and how that can be increased. That's one of the big takeaways actually, is how Scottish clubs make so much less money from selling players than similar leagues.
Had a graph that showed over the periods from like 2000 to 2000, and I can't remember the exact periods, but it had the periods, and basically we've been going backwards versus other nations in terms of making money from selling our players. We are still making about the same in these other countries. Like Croatia was one that was listed, Hungary being another one, that are kind of very similar sized countries, and obviously ones you would want to be competitive with, and ones that our clubs are probably better than. In general, our league will be stronger than that league, but it maybe comes at a cost. Yeah, so there was stuff on that. There's a lot of stuff on research, which I think is quite interesting, and from my own point of view, that actually putting money into funding research into these things and keeping this going. It was a well-researched document itself, and there was a lot of evidence went into it as well, so it wasn't just people saying this is what we think. It's like, here's what's happened. Like, they had lists of the ages that young players made their debuts at top levels in Scotland, and the ages of kind of and people that they've looked at from Croatia and when they played in Norway. And they obviously highlighted that Odegaard made his top tier debut in Norway at 15 and his fourth tier debut at 14, something that's actually not allowed in Scotland. Players aren't allowed to play senior football until 16. I don't know if there will be a recommendation to drop that again, or whether there's like employment law issues, which I think might be what drives it. I have no idea. There was stuff about players being able to sign professional contracts before they were 16, which is currently not allowed, and they might want to legislate or encourage legislation for that. So there's little things like that which are probably even beyond the scope of the SFA to do, because they probably need government fortunately not financial support from the government, but like legislative support, and they probably therefore would need to get a lot better as an organisation at engaging with government, because we saw Ian Maxwell embarrassing himself in front of the nation when he was trying to convince that stuff about the Scottish Cup final, where it doesn't matter what you're saying, if you start off by insulting the people that are or like having a dig at the people who are interviewing you, it's not going to go well.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's loads of like really interesting stuff that I think people will find, and it's very easy for you to. I think it's very easy to sit down and read this and for your own philosophy to kind of come into it. But
you do always find little. I mean, I find quite a few things. Oh yes, I've been saying that. Oh yeah, I've been saying that, and those are obviously loads of other stuff.
Loads of stuff where I'm like, I've been saying this for years, and they're suggesting through evidence that it's just a load of bollocks. But
yeah,
I think the good thing for me is like, there was a bit of chat. Like I remember when with Mike Mulroney, there was like an article via the Daily Mail journalist Stephen McGowan, who's obviously quite. He runs a lot of stories which I think are maybe fed to him by Mike Mulroney in terms of SFA stuff. It seems like one of his main sources in that. And I remember there being a story a wee while back about Mulroney not being convinced of the value of performance skills and wanting to scrap them, or thinking the money could be diverted elsewhere, basically. And I was kind of worried, now that he's obviously quite involved with the SFA, that might come to fruition. But to me, this report is kind of, a lot of the stuff they're talking about is the value of the performance skills that represent, like stuff about player education and stuff about providing other, like elite things and the opportunity to work together and all this stuff, that hopefully suggests that is not the path they're taking, which I do think the performance skills will have a massive impact. As I say, the top players coming out of that are only 23, 24 just now, and that's just the first bunch before they've even learned how to do it quote unquote properly. We are going to see, I think, a queen of those arriving, and it'll be interesting to see if they play differently. The other thing, on a little bit related to that, was talking about positions of players at youth football, and basically saying it's pretty common where a player makes their debut in the first team at a position that wasn't their original position, because, like, for example, centre backs are sometimes it's probably the trickiest position to get a young player into. So often they'll make their debut at fullback, but also if there's injury crises, a player will get thrust into a role they're not familiar with. And it was saying they often thrive in this, but they sometimes lack some of the technical knowledge of that position because they've been too specialised at a younger age. So basically saying try and have less specialist position training at a younger age, which has positives and negatives, I'm sure. But even like you think of like current Scotland players, like Greg Taylor was a central midfielder, and he got his debut at left back. And is now, I mean, he's one of the, I am not saying he's an elite Scotland level player, he's obviously in the Scotland squad, but he's one of the best, he's probably the best left back in the league, and he wasn't even a left back. And there will be loads of examples from various players of, he's just one that came to mind because he was at Kelly, but there'll be loads of examples of players through the leagues where this has happened. So all these little individual things that I think are hopefully just coaching tips that will come through. And that was the other thing on young players. Sorry, I'm just scanning through for bits of myth through the notes I made. Talking about 16-year-olds going south, it's basically, and if they do, try and have like a management, basically have a SFA manager who is keeping an eye on all the 16-year-olds that are playing in England, like just being in constant dialogue with them to be like, right, okay, you're not forgotten
Get
about
back up the road. Yeah.
There was stuff about, goalkeepers.
I was just going to say, I mean, one of my, this is again one of my sort of pet points, and I mean, with more specifically with like a Rangers bent, that I think we should do this, but I think possibly something the SFA could try to implement is like squad restrictions in terms of the amount of players you can have contracted.
Yeah.
And because I think that could have a big benefit in terms of, because it actually talks about like, like first team coaches will always have like the short term in mind, and there's a bias, even if it's not borne out by the stats actually, that you're better playing experienced players, you're going to want to have more experienced players, therefore you're less likely to give a chance to young players. And one way you can do that is basically to give a strong club structure would take that out of the head coach's hands, in that you just say, well, these are the players you've got, so you've got to play, and you're only having so many senior players, so well, if you want to field an 11, you're going to have to pick one of the young players, and that gives the opportunity, and obviously the young players will then they'll have to be of a certain level, otherwise it's going to be a disaster. But people will get opportunities more and develop more. And I do think you could. So it does talk about like, well, if a supporting director builds a 25 player squad, 15 are experienced players, 10 are young players for the academy players will get a lot of game time. And it maybe doesn't need to be quite, and it talks about Monchi, I think it's Aston Villa now. Who was it? Sevilla before when they won all their Europa leagues and so on. And he says, well, you should have like 70% of players should be for now and 30% should be with a view to the future.
There was a little bit about that idea.
Yeah, and I wonder, because obviously in Europe you have to have certain squad numbers.
The Premier League in England's got them as well.
Yeah, Premier League in England's got them, and it would be one thing that I think maybe the clubs would go for it because
everybody else would be in the same boat.
So you would be cutting any kind of competitive advantage away, and you'd actually be saying, look, if we put this in place, you'll all save money if we do it this way. And you could decide how, if you want to just completely mirror the Scottish setup, the European setup, where it's like, I think you can have like 17 players from anywhere, 4 have got to be nation trained, 4 have got to be club trained. You could work out how you want to do it, and then there's like a B list of players that are underneath a certain age, where you could just you can play as many as you want. And something like that, I think would save money. It would also stop. I mean, it's my big bugbear with Rangers is that you get guys on like more than 20 grand a week, and they can't even play in half the games you play because you've not got space for the European
you're not
squad.
Registered in Europe,
yeah. It's like I think it would lead to efficiencies across the board, and you'll be a sort of, it's quite an artificial way to create more opportunities, but I think it's a concrete way you could do it, and you could actually, it would hopefully stop clubs stockpiling players, which is a big problem. I think at youth level, as well as you could potentially have that sort of going down the sort of the teams. Maybe you can only carry so many players at under 18 level. You can only carry so many players between the two, to stop players just sitting there and maybe guys do get released, more players do get released at 16 and go into the rest of the pyramid and make it from there, rather than sitting on the bench of an under 18 team at Premiership level. So I thought that's one thing that I think could also be helped, and potentially the SFE, if they wanted to, could implement.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely scope for that, and as you say, because everyone's doing it, it's not like a team are not going to object because the reason they might object is because of, I think the only reason you can object is if you our academy shit and we're not going to get any good players. We're going to be hamstrung. But yeah, the only other thing I wanted to mention was there was a bit of specific chat about goalkeepers, and it was basically saying there should be a second chance thing where, like, if a basically players should be playing in goals a wee bit more anyway, because it probably broadens their understanding. If you're a striker, probably playing in goals a bit will help you understand goalkeepers as well. But we're basically saying there is a clear lack of goalkeeper development, and we're saying sometimes players who have basically fallen by the wayside as an outfielder should have an intensive chance to retrain as a goalkeeper, because they'll have a lot of the mentalities that are right for footballers from that league. I think that stuff is interesting. And then there was only a small section on women's football, and I think basically it was
that was an afterthought. I thought
that the women's elite game is obviously further behind, but there is also far more younger players get opportunities in women's football in Scotland. Yeah. Like, you look at the teams and there are every week 16, 17, 18 year olds playing, mainly because there's not as many foreign imports as well. And I say foreign, that even includes players from England, because it's part time in almost every club in Scotland, with the exception of I think 4 that have full time players. And so that, like, there is a bit on it and how to do that, but I think the focus was on male football. But it's also, you said the big names that were consulted on. It's got a list at the end, and like Steve Clark was asked about it, and so it's like everything down from the Scotland team. I think 10 of the Premiership managers from last season were asked, and that included like Rodgers and Clement and Naismith. The only clubs that didn't have a manager do it were Hibs, who might just not have had a manager at any given time, and Aberdeen, actually, and then also the other elite youth development clubs, which are Hamilton, Queen's Park, and Dundee United at the time, lower league clubs. All their managers spoke to it. Various youth coaches. I think there was 8 different people from Killie that included, so it was a variety of people from quite a lot of levels, and various people from across Europe as well. And also, I thought you would be really pleased to see that Michael Beale was one of the people.
I did see that, yep.
Yeah. To be fair, a guy who's from his experience at not Bournemouth, Liverpool was so I was mixing up with Warburton in the second phrase. You should ask him as well. He was good at that type of stuff at Bournemouth, Brentford. But Beale was obviously quite heavily involved in youth development at Liverpool, and did work with quite a few of the ones that have made it into their team. But yeah, so I think a little bit of whistle stop of all this, I would really recommend going and reading this report. I found it much more interesting. I was like, when these things come out, I always read them, but I thought this is going to be a bit dull, and I actually found it quite engaging to read. I stopped reading it feeling quite positive, not on the basis I think all of these things will happen. Several of them almost certainly won't. But on the basis that I think the people who were doing it, there was clearly a lot of thought had gone into it. There's a lot of introspection, and I think it's very important to. You could argue the SFA. I know you wouldn't say it as much in August as you would have said it in May. You could argue the SFA could easily be on a bit of a high in terms of they've qualified for the last couple of tournaments. That there are signs on the part for the national team, or had been that things could, it's very easy to get complacent in that position and be like, well, we've qualified for things now, we've maybe turned it around, but it didn't seem to be that way. As well.
Yeah. I think. I mean, if you just take it from the national team, I think we can all. You could almost view it. Are we in the same position now that we were in 1998?
Yeah.
And that we've qualified for 2 tournaments, close to each other. Obviously that was at the time we were always qualifying for things that didn't seem out of an outlier, but the squad was starting to get quite old. And it's maybe not quite as bad right now as it was in 1998, but there are definitely some parallels there where where are the next big players coming from, and in certain positions look very bare. So it is good that we're thinking about it, and yeah, as I say, there has been a lot of work that's gone into this. Hopefully, at least some of the recommendations get taken up. But it does. I think my overriding thought really is still that there needs to be a bigger conversation as to what people want from Scottish football, and if we want to get better, which is a quite nebulous concept. How does a country get better at football? What does that even mean and look like? But if we want to get better, then I think we need to have put some serious thought into making some pretty big structural changes, which will be unpopular with some.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. But we will leave that with you, listeners. Please get in touch with us with any thoughts that you have on how Scottish football could develop as well. But maybe get in touch rather than with us actually with the people at the SFA who wrote the report, because Euan and I are not that. We're just the messengers.
Not yet.
Yeah, exactly. But thanks very much for joining me, Euan, and thank you to all the listeners who make all this possible.